Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be doing a post-mortem on perhaps one of the most consequential races in the history of the United States Congress. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that, because even the Israeli newspaper Haaretz recognized the significance of this race. Their original headline read, "The most consequential Republican primary for Israel is happening in Kentucky." Later, they quietly changed the title to "Pro-Israel Groups Pour Record Sums into Bid to Defeat GOP Rebel Thomas Massie in Kentucky Primary." Clearly, they weren't exactly hiding their cards when it came to Massie at first, but after throwing the stone, they were very quick to hide their hand. Now, part of the reason this race was so consequential is because it exposed a very clear divide within the Republican Party and within our broader political system here in America. As I said yesterday, and I'm going to make the appeal once again right now, we are an occupied nation facing a wartime scenario only comparable to the Revolutionary War. We are currently occupied by a foreign nation, that nation being Israel, which has numerous people loyal to them who are dumping millions upon millions of dollars into influencing our politics in order to serve the interests of Israel. Needless to say, this race has become and will increasingly become symbolic of that dynamic. Now, Thomas Massie was a Republican congressman from Kentucky's 4th District. He had been in office for 14 years. He held roughly a 70% approval rating, which is dramatically higher than the approval rating of Congress as a whole, which is in the single digits. In his last re-election, he won by nearly 75%, absolutely crushing the other Republican in the primary. And that's how well liked this guy was in his district. But as we're going to look at the data coming out of Kentucky, the money spent, the figures involved, the mysterious flood in mail-in ballots at the last minute, this entire situation becomes very strange. Needless to say, a lot of people on one side of the Republican aisle, particularly the more Israel first faction, are not only celebrating this result, but are now trying to obfuscate what happened by claiming the money dumped into this race had zero effect and that this was simply the organic will of Kentuckians against Massie. Now, needless to say, I reject that premise, and in fact, I reject the results of this election. While Thomas Massie may have lost on paper, I do not believe this outcome actually represents the interests of the people of Kentucky, especially when one of Ed Galrain's final speeches was essentially a 13-minute tirade arguing that war with Iran serves America's interests. And as we all know, according to an April 21st State Department memo, we did not become entangled in this conflict with Iran because it served the interests of the American people. In fact, according to the memo itself, America was pulled into this escalation with Iran, this direct conflict with Iran, because of Israel's actions. Now, anyway, as we're going to see here, there is a lot at play. The Israel Influence Network is still extremely powerful. They are pushing back hard, flexing their muscle, and attempting to show who's truly in charge. Now, obviously, President Trump is taking some of the credit for this loss that Massie incurred. He's claiming this to be a win. He largely opposed Massie throughout this race, claiming Massie voted against several measures Trump supported, including the One Big Beautiful Bill and other initiatives. These are policy discussions that we'll get to in a moment, because many of the reasons Massie opposed those measures were because he believed they were not conservative enough. In other cases, his objections centered around fiscal responsibility, government spending, and concerns about the national debt, concerns that many politicians today appear completely unwilling to take seriously, surprisingly enough, within the Republican Party. Gee, I wonder why. See, the Republican Party has historically branded itself as the party of fiscal conservatism and small government, but increasingly it seems that in order to better serve the interests of Israel, many within the party have abandoned those principles altogether. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. Now, in yesterday's video, we capped off by watching parts of Massie's speech as he addressed a packed room. This is the room. Since then, additional footage has surfaced comparing the energy between the two election night events. The Massie room was filled wall to wall, people standing all the way to the back of this conference room, most of them young people, exactly as Massie himself pointed out during his speech. Now, by contrast, the Ed Galrain celebration party looked like a small gathering of mostly boomers, quietly celebrating. That contrast spoke volumes to a lot of people online, particularly on X. Many are now saying that MAGA has exposed itself as the true Israel First movement. Others joke that Galrain's celebration looked like it was taking place in Tel Aviv, and it could very much be Tel Aviv. I can't tell. could be Tel Aviv, but all jokes aside, the contrast between these two rooms is undeniable. The energy behind Massie, the number of people supporting him, all the young people versus the lack of enthusiasm and turnout for Galrain raises obvious questions. Who exactly voted for Ed Galrain? How did he supposedly secure such a large margin over one of the most popular congressmen in the country? And what is really going on here? And this is where we really have to dive into the data, because a lot of people are now comparing previous Kentucky Republican primaries to what just played out in this race, and the numbers are raising a lot of eyebrows. Here's some of the data that's been circulating regarding total Republican primary votes in Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, while Thomas Massie was the incumbent between 2020 and 2026. Now, in 2020, there were roughly 84,000 votes cast, and about 68,000 of those votes went to Thomas Massie, giving him approximately 81% of the vote. And then in 2022, total turnout dropped to around 66,000 votes, with Massie receiving roughly 50,000 votes, maintaining about 75% support. Now, in 2024, turnout dropped even further to approximately 52,000 total votes, with Massie receiving around 39,000 votes, once again holding roughly 75% of the vote. But then suddenly, in 2026, this last election, yesterday, turnout explodes to roughly 104,000 total votes. Ed Galrain receives around 57,000 votes, while Massie receives roughly 47,000. That is a complete inversion of the previous pattern and essentially a doubling of total turnout compared to 2024. Now, there are a couple of things happening here that people immediately noticed. Historically speaking, midterm election cycles typically experience lower turnout. We already saw that trend from 2020 to 2022. But what makes this especially interesting is that more people reportedly voted in the 2026 Republican primary, where Trump was not on the ballot, than in 2024 when Trump actually was on the ballot. That alone is a very interesting distinction. And naturally, this has led many people to speculate about what exactly transpired in this race, particularly regarding the unusually high number of mail-in ballots reportedly used during the election. Now, as I noted earlier, Ed Galrain received roughly 57,000 votes, while Thomas Massie received roughly 47,000 votes. But people also noticed that Galrain reportedly received around 10,854 mail-in ballot votes, while Massie ultimately lost the race by roughly 10,280 votes. And when you begin looking deeper into the turnout figures overall, the situation becomes even more unusual. Massie himself actually increased his own vote total by roughly 19% compared to 2024. Think about that for a second, folks. Despite all the opposition spending, despite the attacks, despite the pressure campaign against him, all the smears, Massie still increased his own raw vote total by approximately 19%. Meanwhile, opposition turnout against Massie surged by roughly 357%. Again, total turnout in this primary essentially doubled compared to 2024, creating what appears to be the highest overall Republican primary turnout in the district's modern history. So naturally, people are asking whether this was truly just the result of organic enthusiasm and a successful get-out-to-vote operation fueled by millions of dollars in outside spending, or whether something else broader was at play here. Because when you lay the numbers side by side, the contrast is staggering. Massie increases his support by 19%, yet the opposition turnout against him somehow explodes to 357%. Then you get into the demographic breakdown, which is another major reason why so many people online are questioning these results. Sam Parker noted that according to the data being circulated, Massie reportedly dominated among younger voters. He won voters between the ages of 18 and 29 by nearly 79%. He won voters under the age of 45 by roughly 65%. He also reportedly won voters under the age of 65 overall by approximately 53%. The one demographic Galrain reportedly won was a 65-plus category, and he reportedly won that group by around 65%. So again, people are asking themselves obvious questions. How exactly does one candidate dominate nearly every younger demographic, fill massive event rooms with enthusiastic supporters, generate overwhelming online energy, yet somehow lose by such a substantial margin? And is that part of the reason debates around election systems, mail-in voting, and legislation like the SAVE Act have become so politically explosive in recent years? Now, to be clear, there is a difference between analyzing unusual voting patterns, asking questions about turnout anomalies, and proving actual wrongdoing. But needless to say, When many people look at these numbers side by side, when they look at the data, the cold, hard data, they don't view this as a normal election outcome. And many are speculating that this situation deserves further scrutiny, especially when you consider that, according to a Daily Caller review of Federal Election Commission records, roughly 85% of donors who contributed the maximum allowable amount to Ed Galrain's campaign had a history of donating to Democratic candidates. That alone raised a lot of questions for people following this race. But then there's another statistic that people on X are also pointing to regarding the number of in-state donors each candidate reportedly had in Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, according to FEC data. See, Massie reportedly had 1,545 donors within Kentucky. Ed Galrain reportedly had 70. Just 70. Absolutely ridiculous. And to many people, a massive sign of the broader problem here. Let me really drill that in for a second, folks. Only 70 people within Kentucky reportedly donated to Galrain's campaign. Kentucky is a state with roughly 4 million people, and Kentucky's 4th Congressional District alone has approximately 776,000 residents, yet only 70 people out of that entire population sample reportedly donated to Galrain in state. I mean, at a certain point, it becomes pretty obvious to people why this race played out the way it did. As we discussed yesterday, these pro-Israel lobbying groups exercise a tremendous amount of influence over this election. They poured tens of millions of dollars into defeating Thomas Massie. As of yesterday, estimates had total spending on this race of $35 million total. They outspent Massie's campaign multiple times over, flooding the district with advertising, mailers, messaging operations, and outside pressure campaigns. And when you combine that level of spending with the turnout anomalies, the donor disparities, the demographic breakdowns, and the broader political context surrounding this race, the conversation around foreign influence, it becomes very clear why so many people view this election as symbolic of a much larger battle within the Republican Party and inside our country as a whole. So it goes without saying that a lot of people were extremely surprised and frankly disturbed when AIPAC openly started gloating on X about defeating Thomas Massie. They initially published a press release saying voters across America sent a resounding message tonight. They support Democratic and Republican candidates who view a strong U.S.-Israel relationship as an American interest and reject those who focus on attacking that alliance and pro-Israel Americans. They then went on to congratulate the candidates they support, including Ed Galrain in Kentucky, Clay Fuller and Houston Gaines in Georgia, as well as Ralph Alvarado in Kentucky. They continued by stating, with tonight's victories, more than 105 AIPAC-backed candidates from both parties will have advanced to the general election this cycle. As this election cycle progresses, AIPAC's 6.5 million members and pro-Israel Americans in every state will remain actively engaged in supporting Republicans and Democrats who share our values and helping defeat those who do not. I mean, I think this really says everything, doesn't it? These people are singularly and laser focused on Israel. They do not care what political party they support. Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. Israel is the sole issue. That is the central priority. And look, at the end of the day, it's a PAC. They have the freedom to advocate for whatever issues they want. That's not even really the point here. The point is the sheer level of influence that a foreign-aligned lobbying interest appears to have over candidates in both political parties. Both parties. Think about that for a second, folks. Over 105 AIPAC-backed candidates advancing this cycle. Republicans and Democrats can barely agree on cutting taxes for ordinary Americans, securing the border, reducing spending, or addressing the cost of living. But somehow, there's overwhelming bipartisan consensus when it comes to Israel. So naturally, people start asking questions. How powerful is this influence network? How many dinners, meetings, lobbying events, donor relationships, and pressure campaigns are involved behind the scenes? Because to many Americans, looking at this from the outside, it appears completely unbelievable and deeply egregious and corrupt, to say the least. Now, needless to say, AIPAC jumped back onto X later to celebrate even further, saying that Ed Galrain's victory in Kentucky and Clay Fuller's victory in Georgia ensured two outspoken pro-Israel voices are positioned to fill seats previously held by outspoken detractors, Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene. They added, our community was proud to help pro-Israel candidates win these races. Marjorie Taylor Greene later jumped in and responded, saying it's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory when a foreign lobby group openly brags that they bought 2 congressional seats with candidates who will be loyal to Israel. AIPAC responded to that saying, "We are Americans. We back candidates who support the U.S. Israel partnership. Voters decide elections." Now, obviously, that is the narrative they're going with, but many people look at the reality of what happened here and conclude that these races were effectively bought through overwhelming outside spending and influence operations. See, when millions upon millions of dollars are poured into a congressional district, one that most Americans can't even point to on a map and don't even care about, when voters are flooded with constant attack ads and mailers, in some cases reportedly receiving 6 separate negative mail pieces targeting a single candidate like Massie, who is otherwise one of the most popular congressmen in the country, people naturally begin questioning whether this is truly organic democratic decision-making or whether voters are being emotionally manipulated through mass propaganda campaigns. And honestly, that opens up to a broader conversation. See, we constantly hear discussions about propaganda in other historical contexts, like, for example, Nazi propaganda and the hysteria it caused. Why can't we have those conversations in the modern propaganda operations currently playing out in our politics? Can we talk about the enormous media lobbying and influence apparatus surrounding Israel and the extent to which these organizations openly acknowledge attempting to shape American public opinion and American politics? Because over and over again, we've seen on this show a massive amount of money being spent to influence narratives, shape policy outcomes, pressure politicians, and manufacture a political consensus around a foreign policy agenda that many Americans increasingly feel does not align with their own interests. It does not align with the interests of this country. Why are people spending hundreds of millions of dollars openly bragging about it during their conventions in order to convince Americans that they should support this state the size of New Jersey? Why? Why can't we just take care of Americans at home? Why can't we cut taxes here? Why can't we make life better here instead? Why do we always have to go to Israel? I want to know, because I've never been to Israel. Now, needless to say, in the middle of this whole conversation around the race in Kentucky's 4th District and Massie being unseated, all of these Israel First voices ended up taking to the internet to defend their precious gem. And this is what journalist John Podhoretz had to say about the situation.
I think it is a good thing if Massie and the people like him and others believe that if you cross the line into anti-Semitism, Jews are going to use the power that we have openly to go for you. Because what other recourse is there? Are we just going to sit here and take it, beg for scraps, hope that nice people are nice to us? The Democratic Party is going explicitly anti-Semitic. We can see it happening. People are getting benefits, as Seth says, for being anti-Semites. That seems to be part of an appeal in primaries to the left in the party. We have to use what means there are at our disposal. And in my view, and I'm going to put it blank, that is Jewish money. There is an enormous amount of Jewish money in politics, by which I mean Jewish donors, wildly disproportionate, not only charitably, but politically. And when I say charitably, I mean nobody really knows the numbers. Jews make up 2% of the population. According to some studies, Jews make up 20% of the charitable contributions made in the United States annually. That is a tenfold. Think about that. Think about the disproportion of that. And in politics, it's pretty close also. And if that money isn't used, why do people give money? Because they want to influence elections to get people elected who reflect their views. Well, this is an existential issue for Jews. And the Jews who explicitly give money because they want to make it clear to anti-Semitic candidates that they are going to have to go through a buzzsaw and that they are not going to simply waltz in and be if they're treated with kid gloves by the New York Times, we are double time going to do what we can to expose who they are, to find out what we can find out about them that will harm them, and that we will do what we can to prevent them from taking office. What other choice does American Jewry have?
This is absolutely insane. They're not even saying the quiet part out loud anymore. They're just openly saying it. This guy literally framed it as Jewish money. Think about that contradiction here for a second, folks. That if any individual were to say the same thing as this guy just said, they would be called an anti-Semite. somebody who's delving into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. In fact, that cover is used so often that the moment anybody criticizes the state of Israel, they are immediately charged with being an anti-Semite, because defenders of the Israeli state instantly conflate criticism of that government with Jewish people as an ethnicity or religion. But then here you have a Jewish individual openly framing this entire political operation as specifically Jewish in nature. So which is it? Because what's happening here is that identity and religion are being constantly invoked as both a shield and a weapon in order to shut down discussion. And that is precisely why it becomes so difficult to have an honest conversation about foreign influence, lobbying power, and foreign policy in this country, because every criticism immediately gets redirected back into identity politics and accusations of anti-Semitism. And let's be honest about why that happens. It happens intentionally. The people engaging in this rhetoric, including journalists and political operatives who frame things this way, often do not actually want a substantive discussion about foreign policy, lobbying influence, or the extent of foreign-aligned pressure campaigns inside American politics. What they want is to block that conversation entirely by making the political cost and the social cost of discussing all of that too high for anybody to take the risk. The goal becomes shutting down scrutiny through social stigma, moral intimidation, financial intimidation, and accusations, rather than actually debating the substance of the issue itself. It's also very interesting to listen carefully to the language being used here. Phrases like putting them through a buzzsaw are incredibly aggressive and gruesome descriptions in the context of political warfare. And many people listening to this will interpret it as an open admission of how political pressure, primarily by the Israeli state, operations are carried out on behalf of this foreign-aligned interest network. Honestly, for most Americans watching this unfold, it is bizarre and jarring, but at the same time, it probably shouldn't surprise anyone anymore. If you genuinely believe in an America First framework, rhetoric like this understandably feels to many people like a displacement of American political power itself. They feel as though American voters, American priorities, and American interests are being subordinated to the interests of another country and another geopolitical agenda. And to take it even a step further here, folks, as we covered yesterday, and as Thomas Massie himself pointed out before, Israel occupies a uniquely close strategic position with the United States. Many critics of current U.S.-Israel policy argue that the relationship is often treated politically as a one-way obligation, where American political leaders are expected to provide unconditional military, diplomatic, and financial support, regardless of broader public opinion or strategic concerns. And the greatest example of that is the fact that Israel is the only country that we have a unilateral defense treaty with. Israel does not have to defend America if America gets attacked, but guess who does? America has to defend Israel if Israel gets attacked. It's the only country in the world we have such a treaty with. Every other country we have a bilateral defense treaty with. You gotta ask yourselves why, folks. Why is this a one-way street? Well, hopefully Ben Shapiro can answer this question.
Well, the future of the GOP, the Republican Party, was up for grabs in Kentucky's 4th congressional district last night. It was the most expensive House primary race in history and a bellwether for what comes next inside the GOP. Thomas Massie versus President Trump, online versus reality, woke right versus traditional Trump right. And Trump won. And reality won. Turns out the future still belongs to the rational right. It belongs to President Trump inside the Republican Party, so long as President Trump is president.
This level of dishonest framing is honestly absurd. I genuinely don't even know where to begin with someone like this, because it feels impossible to even have a real argument anymore with these people. They're so captured. The level of ideological commitment to this Israel first worldview is so overwhelming that every single political discussion simply gets filtered through that lens for these folks. And what makes it all especially ironic is that this very clip that's being passed around of Ben Shapiro celebrating Gal Rain's victory actually undercuts the entire narrative that he's trying to push. As we discussed earlier, and as this clip shows on the side, Massie led in virtually every age demographic under 50, and even led in several demographics under 65 as well. Gal Rain's support, his strongest support, reportedly came primarily from people 65 and older. And yet here you have Ben Shapiro talking about how this race was about the future of the GOP. Look, statistically speaking, that argument makes absolutely no sense. The future of any political movement is in younger voters. That is just objective reality. Voters 35 and under, 45 and under, those demographics determine where a political party is heading over the next several decades. And Massie left comfortably with all of these groups. And I'm not even exaggerating. Meanwhile, Gowrain's strongest support came from older voters, people they basically had to dig out of the grave to go and vote Gowrain. Yeah, Ben Shapiro, former never-Trumper, is out here lecturing everybody about how this is Trump's party and how this is about establishment dominance, pretending like a race where they had to dump tens of millions of dollars, literally smear this guy daily on the internet and on TV, put him on a blackout on Fox News, and numerous other shady tactics is somehow proving the ideological future of the Republican Party belongs to the neocons and the Israel first wing. A lot of people looking at the numbers that are right on the screen, Ben, simply do not buy your argument whatsoever. And the reason this divide is becoming so intense is because many America First voters increasingly feel that these neocons are constantly pushing escalation abroad while dismissing the concerns of ordinary Americans at home. I literally just had a debate with a Jubilee guy, Micah, a few days ago, and I would describe him as fairly neocon on foreign policy. And part of the debate centered around Israel's war strategy in Gaza and whether civilian areas should be bombed in order to target Hamas's infrastructure. My argument was simple. Maybe we should avoid bombing civilian areas whenever possible. That should not be a controversial statement. I later shared part of that clip online on Instagram, and the response from a lot of hardline neocon and Israel First commenters was honestly disturbing. Some were openly making genocidal statements, just dehumanizing Palestinians, saying that they all deserve to die. And for many Americans watching these conversations unfold, that rhetoric is deeply alarming and contributes heavily to the growing backlash that we're seeing now within the Republican Party. You got these Israel Firsters versus America First. And let me tell you something, folks. If you continue pushing Americans, Christians, veterans, and ordinary citizens into a corner politically, culturally, and economically while simultaneously demanding endless loyalty to a foreign nation, you are going to create an enormous backlash inside this country. That is just political reality. People are frustrated. People feel ignored. They feel displaced. And many people feel as though their concerns are constantly treated as secondary to the interests of this foreign country, of Israel. That's why I drew a parallel to the Revolutionary War. That frustration is real. And establishment figures like Ben Shapiro continuously underestimating just how deep that resentment has become is really only going to lead him into further irrelevance. Anyway, Stephen Miller was one of the people to come out and campaign against Thomas Massie. He ended up misrepresenting some of Massie's policy decisions. Let's hear out what he had to say and respond.
Stephen Miller here to talk with you about a very important subject, which is how Tom Massie betrayed America, betrayed you, and betrayed your children. The single most important issue affecting the future of our country is ending the mass third world invasion of America and reversing that invasion. And on the most important issue, on the most important vote, on the most important bill, on the most important day, Tom Massie sided with every House Democrat, every Senate Democrat, Hakeem Jeffries, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer against President Trump, against the American people, and against you and your family. When the time came to vote for President Trump's signature border security and immigration enforcement bill, the bill to provide record funding for ICE and Border Patrol and mass deportation, Tom Massie voted no. Tom Massie voted to kill the bill. Tom Massie sided with the House and Senate Democrats over the sovereignty of this republic. I personally called Tom Massie and I said, Tom, this is the most important vote of your life and career. This is the vote to reverse the invasion of America. We need your vote. We need your support. And Tom Massie said we could all pound sand. He voted against Trump. He voted against the American people. He voted against you. He voted to kill the most important bill of his career. That is the real Tom Massie. He sided with the illegals. He sided with the left-wing NGOs. He sided with the refugee industrial complex. And he sided with the radical Democrats and crazy communists instead of siding with you, your family, your children, and your loved ones. That's the truth. That's what you need to hear. That is what you need to know. When America needed him, when you needed him, when President Trump needed him, Tom Massie sided with the the radical left, and the foreign predators and criminal aliens over the American people.
That has to be one of the most emotionally manipulative and intellectually dishonest political hit pieces I've seen in a long time, because literally every single argument that Miller makes relies on guilt by association, emotional framing, and outright omission of Thomas Massie's actual record. First off, notice how Miller never once actually explains why Massie voted against the bill. Not once. There is zero substantive discussion of the contents of the legislation and the spending levels, the structure of the bill, the constitutional concerns, or the fiscal implications. Why? Because if he actually did that, the entire narrative that Miller is trying to present here would just fall apart. Thomas Massie did not suddenly side with Democrats because he opposes border security. That's just absurd on his face. Massie has one of the most consistently conservative voting records in Congress on immigration, on spending, on federal overreach, and constitutional issues. The man has repeatedly opposed amnesty proposals, opposed bloated omnibus deals, opposed establishment compromises on immigration, and supported strong border enforcement for many years. The reason he voted against this particular bill that Miller is bringing up here was because, according to Massie himself, it massively expanded federal spending, increased debt, and contained provisions he believed violated core constitutional and fiscally conservative principles. That is called voting based on principle instead of party pressure. But Stephen Miller intentionally frames this as Massie sided with Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, and Chuck Schumer. This is one of the oldest tricks in politics. If a constitutional conservative votes against a bloated establishment bill for constitutional or fiscal reasons, propagandists immediately scream, "You voted with Democrats," as though the reasoning behind the vote magically disappears. By that logic, every time Rand Paul votes against military spending or surveillance expansions alongside Democrats, he's suddenly a communist too, I guess. That's just pure nonsense and strictly dishonest. And by the way, let's talk about the irony here for a second, because Miller says Massie betrayed America because he voted against a spending package pushed by the same Republican establishment that constantly lectures Americans about debt while exploding the national deficit every single year. Thomas Massie has been one of the only Republicans in Washington who actually behaves like an old school fiscal conservative. The Republican Party used to pretend it cared about balanced budgets, limited government, and reckless spending. Now, suddenly, all of that gets thrown out the window the moment somebody waves the word Israel around. National security for Israel. It's always for Israel. It's never for America. And notice the emotional manipulation throughout this entire video. He betrayed your children. He sided with foreign predators. He sided with criminal aliens. He sided with communists. These aren't policy arguments, folks. This is just propaganda language. Stephen Miller is trying to emotionally blackmail Republican voters into believing that if someone opposes one specific Trump-backed bill, they therefore support open borders, illegal immigration, and national collapse. That is a completely unserious argument. Thomas Massie did not vote to kill border security. One congressman voting against one bloated spending package does not suddenly erase an entire career of supporting immigration enforcement and constitutional conservatism. In fact, many conservatives would argue the exact opposite, that constantly shoveling trillions in giant federal packages without accountability is precisely how Republicans lose credibility with voters in the first place. And here's a bigger issue, by the way. Miller never addresses the fact that many America First voters are increasingly skeptical of establishment political tactics that rely on fear, on loyalty tests, and emotional intimidation. They say, vote for this bill exactly as written, or you're betraying America. That is not how representative government is supposed to function, okay? Members of Congress are supposed to evaluate legislation independently, not function as rubber stamps for leadership, especially when that leadership is compromised to a foreign nation. And in case you think I'm exaggerating, here it comes straight out of the horse's mouth.
What have you said to Prime Minister Netanyahu about Iran and how long to hold off on strike?
He's fine. He'll do whatever I want him to do.
Oh, really?
Very, very good man. He'll do whatever I want him to do, and he's a great guy. To me, he's a great guy. Don't forget, he was a wartime prime minister, and he's not treated right in Israel, in my opinion. I'm right now at 99% in Israel. I could run for prime minister, so maybe after I do this, I'll go to Israel, run for prime minister. I had a poll this morning. I'm 99%. So that's good. But no, he's a wartime prime minister, and I just don't think they treat him well.
Mr. President, what do you do?
I think they have a president over there that treats him very poorly. And
You're on the same page with him on Iran?
yeah.
Well, Mr. President, with all due respect, if you really want to go be Prime Minister of Israel because they're going to suck up to you, then go right ahead. I think most Americans just want somebody in the Oval Office who's going to put America first. If you want to do that, hey, let's keep doing this. Otherwise, I think Israel, based on everything you've done in the last few years, would truly appreciate you. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.